When thinking about the Plains Indians, there is none fiercer than the Comanches. The Comanches were aggressive, horse warriors that held off the Spanish incursion into the United States and created many new innovations for those who were tasked with fighting them off. The Comanche Empire ultimately fell to the white settlers who fought to gain a foothold in the New World. However, the Comanche story would become legend. An observer can break the Comanche story into two parts: pre-horse and post-horse. Pre-horse, not much is really known about the Comanche. The Comanche, who refer to themselves as the Numina, or the people, were a nomadic hunter-gatherer tribe. Pre-horse, the Numina grounds spanned the entire United States. The Numina eked out a community of survivors. However, they did not have a written language and did not participate in any agricultural pursuits. Gender roles were set and taught from a young age. Most Num children were separated by gender almost from birth. The Num men were the warriors, tasked with protecting the bands, and the hunters who killed the buffalo. Women did everything else, including carrying the Num items from place to place, as the warriors needed their hands free to protect the roving band. Numina were separated into family bands and rarely interacted with other Num bands. There was no discernible leadership, as the Num did not have a chief or leader. An elderly man may become a wise man whose counsel was sought, but this was a hard-earned and precarious position, and not a leadership position. If a Num warrior wanted to go on a raid, he would ask other warriors who would agree to tentatively follow him for the single raid. If the raid went wrong, the warriors would flee, and the war band leader would lose all credibility. There was no expectation of discipline, and those who did not follow orders were not punished. There was no formally recognized marriage ceremony among the Num. Premarital relations were seen as a natural part of life. Young Num couples would quietly move in together and start a life. Wife sharing, especially among brothers, was common, as it was expected of the Num warriors to provide all the food and take care of his in-laws. It was common for brothers to marry sisters and share the burden of caring for the families together. If a Num warrior died, oftentimes his widow would immolate herself at his funeral, because what was waiting for her was a life of starvation and ultimately death, unless another Num warrior took her as his wife. Children were scarce in the Num culture, and as such would be adopted by another Num warrior with no questions, as the birth rate was so low. There are few taboos in Num culture. One large taboo was incest, as Numina understood the danger of having children too closely related. Num were allowed to eat most things. However, it was taboo during times of plenty to eat fish, birds, or frogs. However, during times of starvation, this taboo no longer held. Numina religion was confusing, but all-assuming, infecting every part of Num life. Their religion was centered around what they called magic. Good magic resulted in times of plenty, and bad magic would curse Num warriors and bands with starvation, sickness, and death. Medicine men were a large part of Num culture, as they would help get rid of the bad magic and imbue Num warriors with the buffalo, horse, or bear magic that would help them be successful. Picking a magic was a personal choice, but Numina were loyal to the magic they had picked. Num men were incredibly vain. They would wear hair long and decorate it with feathers and beads. There was no record to state that the type, color, or placement of the feathers had any real significance, as in other tribes. The main source of vanity for the Num warriors was their shield. Looking at the shield decorated with bear teeth, buffalo horns, human hair, and later horse hair would tell you what type of warrior was wielding the shield. There was no taboo about having children out of wedlock. In fact, a Num warrior would choose an unattached pregnant female over a non-pregnant single woman, as the pregnancy proved the woman's fertility. Birth rates were incredibly low, and the Num warrior would simply claim the child as his own, as there was no guarantee that he would produce his own biological children. When giving birth, the father was not allowed anywhere near the birthing teepee. The mother and her midwife helpers would birth the child with the mother's father, the child's grandfather, standing outside the teepee. If the child was alive and a boy, the grandfather would be told, "You have a new close friend and much cause for rejoicing." If the child was a girl or stillborn, he would be told, "It is a girl." or it is dead, in much the same tone. Numina culture changed drastically with the introduction of the Spanish Mustang. While experts are not sure which plains culture adapted to the new horse technology first, they can agree that the Numina acclimated the best. Numina became proficient horse riders and archers very quickly. With the Mustang, the Num culture changed as well. No longer traversing the United States, Numina moved to the plains at the buffalo breeding grounds. They developed a style of quick-draw archery that allowed them to let off multiple powerful arrows within seconds. This made it difficult for the white settlers and soldiers to fight them, as the prevailing weapons of the time were cumbersome, single-loading black powder guns. The white settlers were not able to shoot as many bullets quickly enough to fight off the incoming Numina. The Numina did not engage in warfare with settlers. They also fought with other Plains Indians, including the Apache and the Sioux, for hunting lands. The Numina were brutal in their fighting style and difficult to ambush as they still had no permanent settlements. They simply roamed the plains with their items and set up encampments for no more than a few nights. The Num coupling culture also changed. No longer did young couples quietly move in with each other. A Num warrior now had to have sufficient wealth, horses, to entice the girl's family, to allow them to wed. Premarital relations were still seen as a normal part of growing up, but the girl could not move in with a husband without permission from her father. If a woman eloped or a wife was stolen, the wronged party would demand retribution. This usually happened in the form of horses or services, and very rarely led to bloodshed. As vain as Num warriors were, the women were eminently practical. They wore their hair sheared to their head for ease and were in charge of maintaining the camps. Numina did not have very much in the way of ceremonial wear, but they would make their clothing out of the buffalo hide that they would hunt. In winter, they wore buffalo coats made out of winter coats the buffalo grew. These coats were incredibly warm, and white settlers at the time likened them to the warmth of 4 wool blankets. Clothing for children, when they wore them, was usually made out of rabbit fur. Birth rates were a large problem for the Numina. Their constant horse riding made miscarriages and stillbirths incredibly common. When conducting raids, Numina would kill the men and women and young children, but would kidnap the children between the ages of 10 and 13 and assimilate them into their family bands. This would allow the Numina to continue to grow and help alleviate the worry associated with incest, so that when children were born, the risk of birth defects would be low. The picture of a Numina warrior with a flowing feather headdress is purely from Hollywood. Num warriors would not use something that impractical. The Num warriors, if they did wear headgear, wore a helmet made out of buffalo horns, creating a frighteningly Viking-esque silhouette for those they fought. Young boys were taught the ways of horse archery from a very young age. They would take turns shooting insects out of the sky or throwing coins in the air and shooting these down. The Numina were proficient shooters and even better at riding horses. During a raid, the Num warriors would ride in, always with more horses than riders. They would then circle their victims in a never-slowing gallop around those they intended to kill. They would shoot off arrow after arrow, jumping from horse to horse and swinging around the horses they were riding to use as shields. It was almost impossible to see them and anticipate where the next arrow was coming from. Even though they were deadly, the Num did not stand their grounds once they began taking losses. If too many people were injured or killed, they and their horses would simply depart. Contact with white settlers was contentious. There was one exception, however: the French traders that would work with the Numina to exchange goods, usually buffalo skins, for iron to work into arrowheads. The French traders, themselves nomadic, did not fight with the Numina for space or resources. Also, they did not try to convert the Numina to their religion. This made the Numina more inclined to work with them. The Numina were successful at holding their territory until the near extinction of the American buffalo, caused by the white settlers. The white settlers almost hunted the buffalo into extinction for the sole purpose of removing their tongues for pickling. With the Numina food source completely decimated, they were unable to continue their way of life. Tensions were also high in the land. The Comanches lived in what is now Texas. When removed to the reservation in Oklahoma with the other Plains Indians, the Numina did not stay in this area. They continued to raid Texas lands in an attempt to get their hunting grounds back. There were many failed treaty talks and battles, but there was no victory for the Numina. Their reservation was disbanded in 1901, when there was an estimated number of around 1,800 Numina left. The leaders protested this allotment, as any leftover land was open to the public. The government did not care, and the Numina were further scattered, and their culture was decimated. Recently, there has been a large push to reclaim their culture. In 1936, the Comanches established their own government. As of 1995, there were now 9,722 registered Comanches. As of today, the Numina numbered over 17,000 strong. Many families still live on the land given to them in the allotment, whereas others are spread across the country. The Comanche tribe is still as proud and as strong as they were years ago, defending their country from the settlers from the back of their horses.